The man watched in horror as the sea churned, a massive, thick tentacle rising from the depths. Who could have imagined an octopus this enormous existed? In a flash, it dragged the entire oil rig to the ocean floor. Even a nuclear submarine, dubbed the undisputed ruler of the ocean, was nothing more than a toy in its presence. Welcome, everyone, to the latest monster horror film, Kraken, released in 2025. On the vast Arctic ice sheet, an international scientific survey team was on a mission, deploying deep-sea equipment for research. Unknown to them, a submarine had just passed underneath. Julia, who was collecting data, suddenly felt something was amiss. The tent on the ice seemed to vibrate slightly, and water splattered from the ice hole. The ice in the distance suddenly began to crack. Her colleague, Oscar, realized they might be facing the legendary ice collapse phenomenon. He urgently shouted for Julia to retreat. The two sped off on their snowmobiles at full throttle, but the ice cracked much faster than they could have imagined. Oscar watched from afar as their camp area rapidly surged upward. He cried out in despair as his snowmobile immediately crashed into the rising ice mound. When they regained their senses, the camp ahead had already sunk along with the shattered ice floes. At the same moment, the submarine beneath the waves faced a similar catastrophe. First, they were struck by numerous ice fragments, then all their warning systems began blaring. The submarine seemed to be entangled in something and was sinking at an incredibly fast rate. In the final, perilous moments, the captain ordered a distress beacon released, hoping the military would quickly send aid. Julia and Oscar, having barely survived, now wished they hadn't. They had endured a full day in the blizzard, with no food and no satellite phone signal. It wasn't until they trudged to the edge of an ice cliff near the sea that they finally made contact with an oil rig. But the blizzard was too fierce for the rig to send a rescue team. Just as the two were losing all hope, Julia spotted a blinking red light on the ice in the distance. Filled with renewed hope, they rushed to investigate. It turned out to be a Russian military distress beacon. Oscar exclaimed in surprise, could there be a Russian military base nearby? Suddenly, the ice beneath their feet began to tremble. Julia, thinking it was another ice crack, turned in terror, only to see a submarine emerging from beneath the ice. Both were stunned. Could this submarine be here to rescue us? The truth proved they had overestimated their luck. The distress signal from the initial stricken submarine had indeed been swiftly received by the military. High Command immediately decided to dispatch a rescue force. Even if the submarine was destroyed, they had to recover its wreckage to ensure the mission's successful completion. The military sent their best captain, Victor. This commander did not disappoint, setting off day and night, and soon located the distress beacon. Unfortunately, within a few dozen miles around, apart from the two bewildered survey team members, they found no trace of the missing submarine. After some hesitation, Victor decided to take the two on board the submarine first, otherwise, they would surely freeze to death within 2 days. Of course, Victor had another objective, to gather more information about the missing submarine's whereabouts. Regrettably, Julia knew little more. Had Victor not reminded her, she wouldn't even have known that the unusual signal she'd collected that day was actually from a Russian submarine. However, Julia had a theory. Based on the timing of the incident, she believed the submarine's disappearance was definitely linked to that ice-cracking event. She initially thought it was due to geological activity on the seafloor, but now, upon reflection, that was impossible, as monitoring equipment had not reported any abnormal geological activity. Julia carefully considered and surmised that the only thing capable of causing such a massive disturbance could only be some kind of sea monster. Upon hearing this, Victor suddenly recalled a peculiar experience from not long ago. Just as they were approaching the Arctic Circle, the sonar operator suddenly picked up strange signals. The seasoned veteran on board quickly realized they had encountered a pod of whales. However, what was puzzling was that these massive creatures were usually docile, but this time they occasionally gently bumped against the submarine as if trying to impede them. Victor didn't think much of it and ordered a low-frequency signal to scare the whales away. The sonar operator quickly reported that the captain's method had worked. However, he also detected a vast expanse of unidentified signals on the seafloor. Victor stared at the screen. He couldn't tell what it was. No one saw a small whale swimming beneath the submarine suddenly attacked by a gigantic tentacle, dropping straight to the seabed the next second. At this point, Victor also detected an anomaly. The enormous object emitting the strange signals was moving towards them. Due to limited information, he didn't dare risk opening fire, only able to order the submarine to maneuver into an ice crack in the ice mountain. The unidentified object was too massive to follow. Victor's decision once again saved everyone. They steered the submarine into the deepest part of the crack, finally successfully escaping the gigantic predator. Recently, after hearing Julia's description, Victor realized that monster was the culprit responsible for destroying the ice and causing the submarine's disappearance. Julia, being Swedish, had always viewed sea monsters as mythical beings, so she naturally didn't want to get involved. She remembered the oil rig she had contacted not long ago and asked Victor to take her and her colleague there. Victor checked the map. The distance to the rig wasn't too far, and he was naturally happy to see these two burdens off. However, en route, the sonar operator again picked up a flickering abnormal signal. Victor had a bad feeling. Unfortunately, he couldn't see the shadowy form of the monster moving in the mud at the bottom of the sea. As they neared the oil rig, Victor was about to contact the person in charge there, but unexpectedly, at that very moment, the sea surface suddenly churned violently. Gigantic tentacles emerged from the water. The massive steel oil rig was instantly twisted apart and dragged to the seabed. Victor, from a short distance away on the seabed, finally saw the monster's full form through the periscope. The attacker of the oil rig was a colossal octopus. The team members were all stunned in awe at the sight before them. It wasn't until the rig completely sank into the sea that they reacted and realized they needed to retreat quickly. However, their actions were still half a beat too slow. At this moment, someone reported, "The octopus is rapidly approaching us." Victor decisively ordered 2 torpedoes fired. The octopus's body was too large to evade. But after 2 massive explosions, the octopus was still alive and well. Victor was forced to fire 2 more torpedoes. This time, everyone finally realized that conventional ordnance could not harm the octopus at all. Unfortunately, they didn't have much time for astonishment, because the octopus's gigantic tentacles had already tightly wrapped around the submarine. The submarine, like a piece of rotten wood in the water, continuously rolled under the tentacles' assault. The crew couldn't control the ship to escape, nor did they have the ability to fight the monster. Only Captain Victor remained calm. He recalled his previous experience of escaping into the ice mountain crack, where the octopus only completely disappeared after they anchored the ship and shut down the engines. So, he immediately ordered the radar and engines shut down. The crew members carried out the order without hesitation, not even making a sound themselves. The truth proved Victor had gambled correctly once again. The colossal octopus, a predator that relied on sonar signals, completely ignored the silent submarine. As the submarine slowly drifted out of the danger zone with the ocean currents, all the crew members breathed a sigh of relief. At this point, they hurriedly began repairing the submarine's damage. The most dangerous was the burning torpedo compartment. Everyone worked together to put out the fire, finally bringing it under control. However, the number of injured increased by a few. Julia, though shy, still actively participated in medical assistance. At this point, many crew members began to feel disheartened. "Since we are completely no match for the octopus, it's better to abandon the mission and quickly return to base." But Victor did not forget his superior's reminder: if the submarine's wreckage falls into enemy hands, the consequences will be unimaginable. Ultimately, he dismissed all objections and decided to use the distress buoy as a central point, continuing the search for 3 more days. After that, regardless of the outcome, they would immediately return to base. Over the next 2 days, Victor's submarine searched every area of the seabed. Although they did not find their target, they were fortunate not to encounter the octopus. Then, they accidentally discovered a deep abyss. The submarine had reached its diving limit. To continue exploring, they could only use a specialized submersible. Victor knew this abyss was the only unexplored area, and the missing submarine was highly likely to be down there. So, Victor selected a few team members and personally led the team to control the submersible, slowly entering the abyss. When they descended to a depth of 2,000 meters beneath the sea, the sailors' eyes widened in amazement. They could see the contours of the seabed. Many high-power underwater spotlights revealed numerous shipwrecks. It felt like a giant graveyard. The entire crew kept their eyes wide open, afraid to miss any small detail. Finally, amidst a pile of debris, they found the missing submarine. Only the hull was destroyed, only the living quarters were fairly well preserved. Victor held a glimmer of hope as the submersible connected to the submarine's hatch. This time, he decided to go down personally. Even if no one survived, he wanted to bring the bodies of his comrades back. But as soon as they opened the hatch, they were surprised to see dozens of expectant eyes looking up. When the other crew members learned that their missing comrades were still alive, everyone cheered with joy. At this point, Victor learned the entire story of the submarine's disappearance from the captain. That day, they were attacked by the octopus, and, not surprisingly, they were dragged into this abyss. This place seemed to be the octopus's lair. The large number of shipwrecks here was the best proof. Victor also greatly admired the captain before him, who, in a moment of extreme danger, was still able to preserve the lives of all his crew members. The reconnaissance submersible Victor brought had limited capacity, so with so many crew members, they had to be moved in 2 shifts. Victor let the injured comrades go first. He and the captain stayed behind for another important mission. Although the submarine was severely damaged, many pieces of equipment were still usable. To prevent other nations from salvaging it, Victor decided to activate the submarine's self-destruct program. At this point, the first group of sailors had boarded the reconnaissance submersible. To facilitate their return for the second rescue, the operator had installed a positioning module before leaving. However, no one expected that, even though it was only activated for a few seconds for testing, the octopus, not far away, quickly picked up the signal. When the submersible safely returned to the submarine above the abyss, the eagerly waiting crew immediately began providing medical attention to the rescued injured soldiers. After completing the first transfer, the submersible turned back and continued into the abyss. But not long after it left, the image of the octopus appeared on the radar. The crew immediately panicked. Fortunately, they had learned from their previous experience and quickly shut down the radar and engines. However, this time they were not so lucky. The submarine, after losing power, began to drift towards the abyss. The immense pressure caused the hull to buckle. But at that moment, if they activated the engines, it would surely attract the full force of the octopus's attack. As the crew didn't know what to do, Victor suddenly ordered his subordinates to turn on the pre-placed positioning device. The octopus, catching the signal, immediately abandoned its current target and swam towards the damaged submarine at the bottom of the abyss. The crew breathed a sigh of relief, hastily maneuvering the submarine to the surface. But very quickly, another thought flashed through their minds: what about our comrades at the bottom of the abyss? And then came the self-destruct sequence. Victor had now finished setting up the self-destruct program. He instructed all the crew to take cover inside the reconnaissance submersible. The furious colossal octopus, having just surfaced, tightly coiled itself around the large target that was the submarine. The submersible's occupants were violently shaken. Victor gritted his teeth, forcefully separating the submersible from the submarine. At the same time, he didn't forget to remind the other captain to activate the self-destruct command. Following a burst of energy, the octopus's body instantly shattered into many pieces. No matter how powerful it was, it couldn't withstand an attack capable of reaching space. Finally, the story concluded with Victor and the surviving crew returning to the surface, successfully reuniting with their long-waiting subordinates. That concludes the entire story of the film Kraken. Did you find this movie enjoyable? If you did, please comment 1, if you thought it was just okay, comment 2. Thank you for your attention.